What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Michael and I hope you are having an awesome day. Continuing the Sabatan series. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I am doing a lot of Sabatan. I am a history geek myself. And the fact that they do history and they talk about it before they actually play the song and the reasons why they made that song, very interesting to me, and you guys are loving it as well. So this time we got Primo Victoria, the D-Day landing, Sabatan history. Let's go.
The Western Allies, it is the most often told story of the Second World War.
And it's also the beginning of the Sabatan sound, Primo Victoria.
Through the gates of hell, as we make our way to heaven, through the Nazi lines, Primo Victoria.
Ooh, that's the energy we need in our lives, right?
June 6, 1944, a few minutes after midnight, a couple of British gliders silently touched down in Normandy near the Caen Canal. Moments later, all hell breaks loose. Shouting, the British commandos race towards the bridge, overwhelming the confused defenders with hand grenades and submachine guns. In minutes, Benouville Bridge, codenamed Pegasus, has been taken. The first phase of Operation Neptune has begun. Neptune, as part of Operation Overlord, was designed to storm the German defenses on the French coast and establish a beachhead to strike further into Normandy. A massive amphibious landing was to be undertaken to open a new front in the war against Nazi Germany and its allies. At 5 different places, the Allied forces would land.
Craziness.
Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword.
Alright, so just looking at this map real quick, I had done a report, I believe in the 5th grade, and there was the Rangers, or some sort of commando spec ops force, where they actually climbed a steep, Point du Hoc, I believe it's called, Point du Hoc. They climbed this very, very steep, cliff, 100 yards high, 100 feet high, whatever it was, and they actually sabotaged the German defenses there. Part of the reasons to do that was it was overlooking the crescent, or the valley, or the bay, in which it would have been a bloodbath. And I believe that was in Omaha Beach. This is kind of cool to see another map of this.
Thing is, the actual landing at the shore was only to take place after a lot of other chess pieces had been moved. It was vital to the success of the operation that paratroopers and commandos would go in first, soften up the German defenses in the rear, and disrupt their communications. Brigadier James Hill had told his men before, "Gentlemen, in spite of your excellent training and orders, do not be daunted if chaos reigns. It undoubtedly will."
Amen.
Far on the western side, the 1st American paratroops of the 82nd and 101st landed. They were to protect the gap between Utah and Omaha beaches, and, like the British further east, would destroy as many of the German coastal batteries and anti-aircraft guns as possible. The Germans were aware that an invasion was coming. The concentration of force around the British Isles was obvious, but they did not know the exact date nor the location. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in charge of the German defenses at the Atlantic Wall, had made repeated visits to Normandy. Now, if the invasion was to begin here, the Allies would find not one, but several obvious landing zones. So Rommel worked the construction companies to improve the local defenses. He ordered the flooding of fields, the tightening of minefields, and the creation of anti-airborne poles. But whatever he did, it seemed like nothing could ever be enough. The length of the Atlantic Wall was just too large, and the Germans lacked both the resources and the manpower to create a solid wall of fortresses. Now, on the night of June 6, the German soldiers awoke to flak fire and explosions. Local commanders hung on the telephones trying to get any sort of orders or information about what the hell was going on. Was this the invasion? Was it a raid? Was it just another bombing run? Fate had it that Rommel was far away in Germany just then, and at the same time, most of the Wehrmacht High Command was either in Paris or basically anywhere except where the fighting was actually happening. Many lower-ranking commanders lost their heads, sending their local reserves in the hopes of stopping the invasion as it began. And at first, German resistance was decidedly lackluster. Many sites were guarded by men from Eastern Europe, often Poles, Czechs, or from the Soviet Union, who were pressed into service with the Wehrmacht. They had neither the training nor the will to stand up to the aggressive attackers. This allowed the first waves of paratroopers, the Pathfinders, to place radio beacons and Hall of Fame lights to mark the landing zones for the real attack. Soon, over 13,000 Allied paratroopers dropped from their transport planes. In small groups, they fought, ambushing the Germans and attacking their barracks and patrols throughout the night. It was absolute chaos. Firefights were reported seemingly everywhere, and German officers had a hard time getting any assessment of the situation. In other words, the paratroopers were doing their job. The second phase could begin.
See, that's crazy. I mean, you see some of the footage, and I really enjoy how they actually go back and they find a lot of this footage, you know. And yeah, you could find it on YouTube, but to just have it in kind of a collage while it's being spoken about makes it so much easier to understand. You know, I read a lot about World War II, specifically D-Day. You know, being American, that's one of the biggest things that is talked about is the D-Day landings. Well, you look at the clips and pictures of the paratroopers landing, and it's crazy to think about how many people were basically parachuting out of these planes, and just seeing the one picture and clip right there of the sky literally being scattered with parachutes and men landing. Crazy times.
Each hour, a huge swarm of American and British bombers made its way to Normandy. Since April, they had intensified their efforts to pound the German positions into non-existence. But Allied High Command was not taking any chances. Once more, they would try to level anything the Germans had put in front of the landing zone, preferably the anti-aircraft casemates and high-caliber naval guns. RAF Bomber Command dispatched Halifax and Lancaster heavy bombers. The U.S. Air Force sent out Flying Fortresses and Liberators at the forefront, Mosquito bombers, Thunderbolts, Marauders, rocket-firing Typhoons. Pretty much anything that had a cool name was to be thrown against the German Atlantic Wall.
That's a good point right there.
Over 11,500 Allied aircraft would attack and wreck the German positions on the French coast this morning.
Wow.
The Luftwaffe might as well.
That's insane. This is the biggest landing in modern day history. Still is, I believe, to this date. Just the sheer numbers, but almost 12,000 planes. That's unheard of. Can you imagine what the sky must have looked like? You know, they might have sent it in waves, but still the saturation in the sky, unreal.
Have not existed at this point because there was no way of even making a dent into that kind of force. Then the final third phase began, as the guns of the navies opened up. Whatever the bombers had missed now took direct fire from 900 warships of the Royal Navy and 200 warships from the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Under cover of their shelling, the landing crafts made their way slowly through the strong waves. Over 4,000 boats had been brought along to carry troops, tanks, and war material into the designated landing zones. Even duplex-drive Sherman tanks and waterproof Churchill tanks were to be landed. At around 6 a.m., the first thousands of American, British, and Canadian troops were about to close in on the beaches. The coast in front of them was burning and clad in smoke and morning mist. The Pathfinders had enjoyed the element of surprise. But this element was quickly fading. The Germans were now on full alert and began arming and organizing themselves. They set up defense perimeters at the beaches, manning the guns in the bunkers and resistance nets. Nearly all of their large artillery guns had been destroyed in the bombardment, as it turned out. Machine gun nests, the smaller bunkers, the control centers for the Goliaths, everything had gone up in flames. What the Germans were left with were little groups of men with small arms and mortars. Now, Hollywood and video games often portray the defenders as a large army of elite Nazi veterans, but in reality, this was the Wehrmacht of 1944. Much of the Normandy defenses were orchestrated by experienced NCOs, sure, but the men under their control were mostly teenagers or men over 40. Many of them could not have served in the army before because of health issues, but the German army had been scraping the bottom of the barrel. However, even a frightened recruit can pull the trigger.
Yeah, see, that's a crazy story that he's talking about, but that's something that I actually knew is we portray the D-Day victory through propaganda that they were these advanced, elite soldiers, when in reality, the elite units were on the Eastern Front dealing with the Soviet Union. And these guys, like they said, were kind of just forced into service through the Waffen and a wide variety of, countries and inexperienced soldiers, young kids, older gentlemen. Tough stuff. War is not fun.
Of an MG-42 machine gun, and the Germans still possessed quite a number of those. With the advantage of the Defender, they prepared to rain down 1,400 rounds a minute over the beaches. Utah Beach was, like most other landing zones, a long strip of sand, but intercrossed by dunes that provided a modest amount of cover. As the landing crafts opened their ramps, the men burst out. Immediately, machine gun and small arms fire smashed into their ranks. Despite the heavy damage they'd taken, many of the German casemates were still standing, and the German soldiers fired from their gun slits into the oncoming landing craft. Luckily for the Americans, the Sherman tanks had arrived as well, providing cover as combat engineers raced across the dunes, trying to blast their way through the barbed wire. To the east at Omaha, the Americans were not quite as lucky. There was no trace of the supporting tanks. In fact, 30 of 32 had sunk into the sea. And while most of the German defenses at Utah had been obliterated, quite a number of their resistance nests here were still functional. Mortar shells tore into the landing craft, killing a third of the 1st Company outright. Then at 6:31, the first assault ramps went down.
Omaha Beach. Tough spot. Wow.
As the Americans struggled to get out, the German machine guns tore into the packed groups of men, killing dozens in mere seconds. Bodies piled up in the landing crafts, and many panicked, jumping into the water, only to be dragged down by their kit. Still, the soldiers pressed on, out of the boats and onto the beach. The first waves were completely exposed to the German machine guns as the men ran.
This picture right here is incredibly iconic, and I think we've seen it in pretty much every history book, any sort of World War II book. This is the picture that is shown, but we always talk about Omaha Beach being a war zone. It was quite that.
Over the sands. For the only option was to make a mad dash towards the end of the beach, despite their instincts telling them to lay down behind the smallest amount of cover. The NCOs spurred their men on as mortar shells screeched past them. All around them, men were shot or blown apart, but more and more American soldiers were arriving. There were simply too many for the overheating MG-42s to take on. Eventually, small groups of men made it to the beach wall, firing back at the Germans, while the engineers blew holes into the barbed wire with Bangalore torpedoes. The British forces at Gold and the Canadians landing at Juneau fared better, as tanks and infantry arrived pretty much simultaneously. Facing only light opposition, they quickly pushed onward and beyond the beaches, under the cover of the Churchill tanks, which were armed with bunker-busting mortars or flamethrowers. They systematically cleared enemy strongpoints. Mines and machine guns were still deadly, but not in enough numbers to stop them. At Sword Beach, however, where the British infantry ran into a similar hail of fire from machine guns and mortars as at Omaha, 200 men had been killed or wounded in mere minutes, and the men were pinned down on the beach. Single 88mm guns blew the landing craft apart, and bleeding and burning men littered the beach. Several Churchill tanks were even knocked out. But even in all that chaos, the Allies made progress. They literally blew their way through and out of the German defenses. Explosive charges and tanks hammered the bunkers and casemates, and once one German strongpoint was overcome, the others were open for attack. So, like a house of cards, the German defenses fell apart. The men overran the German resistance nests, often not stopping to take any prisoners. They cracked the bunkers with high explosives, then cleared them with grenades and flamethrowers. The surviving Germans were in full retreat.
Wow.
By around 9 a.m., D-Day was looking pretty good for the Allies. So far, the Atlantic Wall seemed to be fully penetrated. The German beach defenses had been overrun and the major strongpoints overcome. From all sections, the troops were pushing onward, trying to keep the Germans from forming new defensive lines. But Although the Wehrmacht had been pushed back, it was not beaten. In fact, new battle groups were formed, and the Panzer divisions and highly mobile Waffen-SS were making their way north. The gates to hell had been pushed open, and if the Allies wanted to free France from the Nazi stranglehold, they would have to make their way straight through the German lines.
Well, I think that's enough information that we need to go react to Primo Victoria, the D-Day landing from Sabatan. You know, crazy, being an American, learned quite a bit about D-Day, being a amateur historian, if that. I've read quite a bit about D-Day. But anyways, I'm looking forward to reacting and checking out Primo Victoria. Getting little bits of clips right here, but it'll be interesting to see what fully is involved with the song. So, stay tuned for that. And as always, stay healthy, stay happy, and have a blessed day. Peace.